remember a song you did with Ethel Merman in Red Hot and Blue.
Red Hot and Blue, yeah.
For generations of Americans, Bob Hope seemed almost permanent. He was there on the radio, on movie screens, at the Academy Awards, and on distant military bases where young Americans spent Christmas far from home. He made presidents laugh. He entertained soldiers through war after war. And for nearly 7 decades, there was another familiar figure somewhere beside that enormous public life. Dolores Hope, the elegant wife who seemed to represent the one thing in his restless world that never changed. Their marriage became one of Hollywood's great stories of endurance. When they reached their golden wedding anniversary, reporters naturally wanted to know how they had managed to stay together for 50 years. Bob answered the way America expected Bob Hope to answer. "I've only been home for 3 weeks in 50 years. Everyone laughed. It was a perfect Bob Hope line. But looking back now, there is something strangely revealing about that joke, because he really was away much of the time. There were movies, broadcasts, golf tournaments, benefits, and those famous USO tours that carried him across oceans and into war zones. And there were also women, not simply one whispered Hollywood romance, but allegations and accounts that stretched across decades of his life. Some were brief, others appear to have lasted much longer. One woman became so closely associated with him that people around Paramount reportedly began calling her Mrs. Bob Hope. Yet the real Mrs. Hope remained where America had always seen her. She attended public events. She raised their family. She maintained their home. And according to their daughter Linda, Dolores almost certainly knew what was happening. That is where this story becomes more complicated than a simple tale of an unfaithful husband and a wronged wife. Dolores did not publicly wage war against him. She did not walk away. She remained beside him until his death in 2003, after what the world had celebrated as 69 years of marriage. Perhaps she had reasons outsiders could never completely understand. Perhaps the meaning of marriage to a deeply religious woman born in 1909 was different from the meaning we might give it today. Or perhaps there was something between these two people that could not be seen from the outside at all. Dolores would eventually leave behind one deceptively simple clue. "If it hadn't been a good one, I'd never have stayed." Those words become harder, not easier, to understand once the rest of their story is known. Because decades after that famous February 1934 wedding date entered Hollywood history, a biographer went searching through the old records. He found documentation connected to an earlier marriage involving Bob Hope. He found a later divorce record. But the document one would expect to be easiest to find was nowhere to be found: a marriage license for Bob and Dolores. That absence does not by itself tell us exactly what happened, and the surviving record leaves questions that deserve caution. But it creates an extraordinary mystery at the center of one of Hollywood's longest and most celebrated unions. For 69 years, America thought it knew what held Bob and Dolores Hope together. By the end of their lives, the more interesting question was not simply why Dolores never left. It was this: after the absences, the other women, the children they raised, the faith she carried, and all those decades under the same famous name, what was this marriage really built upon? To understand that, we have to go back before Dolores Hope existed in the public imagination, to a young woman in a Manhattan nightclub who had a voice, a paycheck, and a future of her own. Long before America knew her as Mrs. Bob Hope, Dolores Defina had a life that belonged entirely to herself. Born in the Bronx in 1909 to an Italian-American family of modest means, she grew up in a household shaped by difficulty. Her parents' marriage did not last, and she was raised largely under the influence of a strong-willed mother. She was educated by nuns, and the Catholic faith she encountered in those early years would remain one of the deepest constants of her life. But Dolores was not simply preparing for marriage or waiting for someone famous to discover her. By her early 20s, she was already earning a living with something unmistakably her own: her voice. Performing professionally under the name Dolores Reed, she sang in nightclubs and with society orchestras around New York. She had a warm, low contralto and real engagements, including the Vogue Club on 57th Street in Manhattan. In an era when a young woman's independence could be fragile, especially in the entertainment business, Dolores had managed to build the beginnings of a genuine career. She had bookings, she had a paycheck, and she had every reason to believe that music might remain at the center of her future. Then in December 1933, a young Broadway comedian came into the Vogue Club. Bob Hope was not yet the national institution Americans would later know, but his career was moving quickly. According to the story the couple repeated for years, a friend suggested that he come hear the young woman singing there. Dolores sang "It's Only a Paper Moon," and Bob was captivated. Their courtship moved quickly. He returned to see her, and although she was reportedly not immediately overwhelmed by his charms, the persistence, humor, and magnetism that worked so well on audiences eventually worked on her too. Within weeks, their lives were becoming intertwined. The date they would later give for their marriage was February 19, 1934, in Erie, Pennsylvania. The questions surrounding that date would not emerge publicly until many decades later. At the time, what mattered was that Dolores began traveling and performing with Bob. She joined his vaudeville act, which allowed the young couple to remain together as his career gathered momentum. At first, it may not have looked like a sacrifice at all. They were both entertainers. They were young. They were working. They were building a life. But the balance slowly began to change. Hollywood wanted Bob. Radio wanted him. Paramount wanted him. Soon the road pictures with Bing Crosby would help turn him into one of the most recognizable entertainers in America. And somewhere during that extraordinary ascent, Dolores Reed began disappearing from the bill. There was no dramatic farewell performance, no announcement that she had abandoned her ambitions. Her career simply became smaller as his became larger. Before long, the singer who once had her own bookings was increasingly known by another identity, Bob Hope's wife. It would be easy looking back to decide for Dolores what that change must have meant, but she left little evidence that she wanted anyone to pity her for it. Instead, she redirected the same discipline she had brought to her singing career toward a new life. A home had to be built, a family had to be created, and a husband whose career was beginning to carry him everywhere needed someone to preserve the one place to which he could return. Years later, the world would remember the comedian who seemed to be everywhere. But behind that story was a quieter transformation. One career was becoming enormous. Another was slipping almost silently out of view. Dolores could not have known then that it would be more than half a century before America would truly hear that voice again. By the time Bob Hope's career began moving at full speed, the marriage had settled into a rhythm that would define it for decades. His world kept expanding outward, while Dolores's became increasingly centered around the place he left behind. In 1937, after several years in New York, the couple moved to Los Angeles and eventually made their home in Toluca Lake. It would remain the center of their family life for decades. But there was something missing from that home that neither success nor money could immediately provide. Children did not come naturally to the couple, so Bob and Dolores built their family through adoption. Linda arrived in 1939. Tony followed in 1940. Kelly and Nora came later. 4 children would grow up carrying one of the most recognizable names in American entertainment. But inside the house, their daily world depended largely on their mother. Bob's career was becoming too large to fit comfortably inside ordinary family life. His radio work demanded him. Paramount demanded him. Movies demanded him. Then there were benefits, personal appearances, golf events, and an endless procession of commitments that seemed to multiply with every new level of fame. And beginning during World War II, another responsibility became inseparable from his public identity. Bob began traveling to entertain American servicemen. What started in the early 1940s grew into a remarkable tradition that would follow him through World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Christmas after Christmas, while millions of American families gathered around their own tables, Bob was often thousands of miles away, standing before young soldiers who desperately needed a reminder of home. For the men and women he entertained, those journeys meant something profound. His presence brought laughter into places where there was often very little to laugh about. That part of his legacy deserves to stand on its own. But every public act of service also had a private consequence. While audiences saw the entertainer boarding another airplane, Dolores saw a husband leaving home again. She managed the children, the household, the schedules, and the quiet responsibilities that never appeared in headlines. There were birthdays he could not always attend, ordinary evenings he did not share, and long stretches when the family learned to function around his absence rather than his presence. Yet when photographs were taken, the Hope still looked reassuringly permanent. Dolores appeared composed and elegant. Bob returned with another joke. America saw stability. Perhaps in its own unusual way, there really was stability. The arrangement endured because each of them seemed to occupy a different part of the same life. He belonged to stages, soldiers, studios, and audiences. She became the keeper of the home to which he returned. Years later, when Bob joked that he had been home for only 3 weeks in 50 years, the exaggeration worked because everyone recognized the restless performer behind it. But for Dolores, the joke must have carried another meaning. 50 years of absence could not be measured only in airline tickets or hotel rooms. It was measured in all the ordinary days someone else had to hold together. And gradually there was another dimension to those absences. The road was not always occupied by work alone. Women began appearing around Bob with a frequency that people inside show business could hardly ignore. Some names would become rumors. Others would leave a clearer trail. And eventually one woman would stand beside him so often that people at his own studio reportedly began calling her by a name that already belonged to someone waiting at home, Mrs. Bob Hope. By the late 1940s, Bob Hope was no longer simply a successful comedian. He was becoming an American institution, and the larger his world became, the more difficult it must have been to keep his private life entirely separate from the people around him. Stories of women followed him through those years, but not every story can be established with the same certainty. Some remain rumors. Others appeared in later biographies and recollections, with enough detail to become part of the complicated record surrounding his marriage. One of those women was Barbara Payton, a striking young actress whose relationship with Bob was reported to have begun in the spring of 1949. According to later accounts, he rented a furnished Hollywood apartment for her, and when the relationship ended after several months, money was allegedly paid in an effort to keep the affair private. Whatever agreement existed did not keep the story buried forever. In 1956, Payton spoke about the relationship to Confidential magazine. But another story from that same year, 1949, reveals something more important about Dolores. Bob later reportedly told a friend that he had become briefly involved with Doris Day while the two were traveling on a March of Dimes fundraising tour. Neither Doris nor Bob publicly confirmed such a relationship, so the story deserves to remain where the evidence leaves it, an allegation preserved in later accounts. Yet the scene Bob reportedly described upon returning home is difficult to forget. Dolores was waiting at the airport in Burbank. When her husband arrived, she greeted him with a conspicuously warm embrace. According to Bob's later telling, Doris understood the gesture immediately. Dolores was marking her territory. No accusation was made. No public confrontation followed. There was simply a wife standing at the airport, embracing her husband and reminding everyone watching where home was. If that episode offered a glimpse of how Dolores handled what she may have known, what happened next would have been much harder to overlook. Around 1950, Bob became closely involved with singer and actress Marilyn Maxwell. Unlike a passing name whispered after a tour, Maxwell was repeatedly beside him in public and professional life. She appeared with him in the Lemon Drop Kid and Off Limits. She performed with him, traveled with his shows, and joined his USO appearances. Their association reportedly continued for several years, roughly from 1950 to 1954. People around Paramount saw them together so often that Maxwell acquired an extraordinary nickname, Mrs. Bob Hope. Imagine what that name meant beyond the studio joke. At Toluca Lake, there was already a Mrs. Hope, raising 4 children and maintaining the family home, while another woman was traveling through part of her husband's public world under a version of her own title. Yet Dolores stayed. Their daughter Linda would later say she was sure her mother knew what was happening. Linda also believed that none of the other women ever held the same significance for her father that Dolores did. Perhaps that distinction mattered greatly inside a marriage whose rules outsiders could never fully see. Bob could travel, other women could appear and disappear, but Dolores remained at the center of the permanent life. The children, the home, the family name, the charities, and the place to which he returned. We should be careful not to mistake her silence for ignorance, just as we should be careful not to pretend we know exactly what that silence cost her. There is no diary telling us what she felt when she heard another woman's name. There is no recorded confrontation explaining where she drew the boundaries of her marriage. What survives is something far more difficult to interpret. She appears to have known. She remained. And as the years passed, that decision would become the greatest mystery of their marriage. The question was no longer whether Dolores could see what was happening. The question was why, after seeing it, she continued to choose the life they had built together. Why Dolores stayed is the question that followed their marriage long after the rumors stopped being whispers. From the outside, the answer can seem almost obvious. A husband was away for months at a time. Other women entered his life. At least one became familiar enough around his studio to be called Mrs. Bob Hope. Dolores appears to have known far more than the public understood. So why remain? The temptation is to choose one explanation and make the story simple. But Dolores Hope lived inside that marriage for nearly 7 decades, and her reasons may have been as complicated as the marriage itself. Faith was certainly part of the world through which she understood commitment. Raised Catholic and educated by nuns, she remained deeply religious throughout her life. For a woman of her generation and convictions, marriage was not merely a legal arrangement that became optional when life grew painful. It carried a spiritual meaning that outsiders could easily underestimate. But faith alone does not explain everything. There were 4 children whose home Dolores had spent years creating. There was Toluca Lake, the place she managed while Bob crossed oceans. There were charities, friendships, responsibilities, and a public life they had built together. There was financial security and extraordinary social standing, realities that should not be ignored simply because they complicate a romantic story. And there was Bob himself. Whatever happened away from home, Dolores apparently did not view those other relationships as the complete measure of the man she had married. Their daughter Linda later suggested that her mother knew about her father's behavior, while also believing that none of the other women meant to him what Dolores did. That distinction may sound difficult to understand today. Perhaps it was difficult then as well, but it belonged to them. Bob kept returning to the same home. Dolores remained the mother of his children, the woman beside him at major public occasions, and the permanent figure in a life filled with temporary arrivals and departures. None of this tells us whether she was happy every day. We do not know that. It does not tell us whether she cried in private, became angry, forgave him repeatedly, or simply decided there were parts of his life she would not allow to define hers. We do not know those things either, and perhaps respecting Dolores means resisting the urge to invent them. What we do have are her own words. Asked about the longevity of the marriage, she once offered an answer that was remarkably simple. If it hadn't been a good one, I'd never have stayed. It is easy to hear that sentence and immediately argue with it. How could a marriage containing so much absence and alleged infidelity still be called good? But perhaps that is the wrong question. The more revealing question may be, what did good mean to Dolores? Maybe it meant children raised in a stable home. Maybe it meant companionship that survived things outsiders would not tolerate. Maybe it meant faith, security, shared history, affection, loyalty of a different kind, or the knowledge that however far Bob wandered, there remained one part of his life no other woman replaced. Perhaps it meant several of those things at once. We cannot know. What we can say is that Dolores was not simply standing still while Bob lived. She was making decisions too. And the most important of those decisions was one she made again and again: to remain. Decades later, something unexpected would happen that makes that choice even more interesting. The young singer who had disappeared behind the name Mrs. Bob Hope had never entirely disappeared. At 81 years old, Dolores would step onto a stage again, and the voice she had set aside more than half a century earlier would finally be heard. For most of her adult life, Dolores Hope had been introduced by a name that connected her to someone else. She was Mrs. Bob Hope, the woman beside one of America's most famous entertainers, the mother who helped hold their family together, the familiar figure at benefits, premieres, church events, and charitable causes. Yet long before any of those roles belonged to her, she had been Dolores Reed, a professional singer standing under nightclub lights in Manhattan. That part of her life had never completely vanished. She still sang from time to time, at private gatherings, at church, and occasionally on her husband's programs. But the career she had once begun building for herself had remained largely in the background for more than half a century. Then in December 1990, something remarkable happened. American forces were gathering in the Persian Gulf, and Bob Hope, now 87, once again traveled overseas to entertain the troops. By then, these Christmas journeys had become almost inseparable from his identity. Generations of servicemen had watched him arrive with comedians, musicians, actresses, and singers, bringing a small piece of America to places very far from home. This time, however, one of the singers traveling with him was different. Dolores was 81 years old when she stepped before American troops in the Saudi desert. She was no longer the young nightclub performer Bob had first heard in New York nearly 6 decades earlier. Her hair was white. Much of her life had been spent outside the spotlight that followed her husband. But when she began to sing White Christmas, the old identity suddenly seemed very close again. The response was deeply emotional. Here was an elegant woman, old enough to be a grandmother to many of the young people in front of her, singing one of the songs most closely associated with home at a moment when home felt impossibly far away. For the soldiers, it was a moving performance. For Dolores, it became something more. People began paying attention to her voice again. In the years that followed, she recorded music and released albums while already in her 80s. She returned to cabaret and concert appearances, and at 84 she performed at the London Palladium, one of the great stages her husband had known during his own extraordinary career. There is an easy way to tell this chapter as a story of a woman finally reclaiming something her marriage had taken from her. But Dolores herself does not seem to have framed her life that way, and perhaps we should not do it for her. The more interesting truth is quieter. The same marriage that had once pulled her away from a career eventually helped lead her back toward one. The USO tours that had taken her husband away from home for so many Christmases became the road that returned Dolores to a stage. She did not need to erase the previous 50 years to become a singer again. She simply stepped forward and used the voice that had been there all along. By then, Bob's own life was beginning to slow. The man who had spent decades rushing toward the next stage, the next flight, the next audience could no longer keep moving forever. And as his world gradually became smaller, the balance inside their marriage began to change once more. After so many years of Dolores waiting at home for Bob to return, the wanderer was finally coming home for good. For most of their marriage, movement had defined Bob Hope's life. There was always another audience waiting, another airplane to catch, another military base. television studio, golf course, benefit, or stage somewhere beyond Toluca Lake. Dolores had learned long ago how to build a family around that movement. But by the 1990s, time was beginning to accomplish what marriage had never tried to do. It was slowing him down. The entertainer who had spent most of the century moving toward the next performance gradually began retreating from public life. His eyesight weakened. His hearing declined. His body could no longer keep pace with the schedule that had once seemed endless. And after decades in which Dolores had so often been the one left at home, the geography of their marriage quietly changed. Bob was home more now, and she was there with him. There was something almost circular about it. The young singer who had once adjusted her life around an ambitious comedian had become an elderly woman caring for the man whose name had filled theaters and television screens across America. The world knew Bob Hope as the tireless performer who seemed incapable of standing still. Dolores knew the older man after the applause had faded, when travel became difficult and the familiar house at Toluca Lake became increasingly important. During those final years, another quiet change took place. Dolores had remained a devoted Catholic throughout her life, attending Mass and supporting Catholic institutions and charitable causes. Near the end of his own life, Bob was received into the Catholic Church. We cannot know everything the decision meant privately between them, but after nearly 70 years together, the husband whose life had so often carried him into a world beyond hers had, in one important respect, entered the spiritual world that had sustained her from childhood. Then came one final exchange that sounded exactly like Bob Hope. As his 100th birthday approached and his health continued to decline, he was reportedly asked where he wanted to be buried. Even then, the old comedian had a line ready. "Surprise me," he told Dolores. Bob Hope died at his Toluca Lake home on July 27, 2003, only 2 months after turning 100. The man who had entertained generations of Americans, crossed oceans to perform for troops, hosted the Academy Awards again and again, and spent much of his married life away from home, had finally stopped traveling. Dolores was 94, and this time, the final destination was hers to choose. She selected San Fernando Mission Cemetery, where Bob was laid to rest in a memorial garden associated with the Catholic faith that had shaped so much of her life. It was not necessary for Dolores to make a statement about the choice. The image said enough. A man whose life had been measured in departures was given a permanent address in a place deeply connected to the woman who had spent decades waiting for his returns. Dolores lived another 8 years. She remained involved with the family legacy, philanthropy, and the faith that had accompanied her for more than a century. Remarkably, music remained part of her life as well. At her 100th birthday celebration in 2009, the former Manhattan nightclub singer was still able to sing. She died at home on September 19, 2011, at the age of 102, and was buried beside Bob in the same mission garden. From the date they had always given for their wedding in 1934 until Bob's death, the world counted 69 years together. 2 graves now seem to provide the final punctuation to one of Hollywood's longest unions. But the story was not finished. 3 years after Dolores died, a biographer published the results of a search through old records, and what he could not find would reopen a question that had been sitting quietly beneath the Hope marriage for nearly 80 years. 3 years after Dolores Hope was laid to rest beside Bob, a question emerged that seemed almost impossible after everything America had been told about them. In 2014, biographer Richard Zoglin published Hope, Entertainer of the Century, and his research into Bob's early life led him back to the beginning of the famous marriage. For decades, the story had appeared simple. Bob and Dolores said they were married on February 19, 1934 in Erie, Pennsylvania. That date was repeated in biographies, anniversary stories, and accounts celebrating one of Hollywood's longest unions. But when Zoglin searched the surviving records, the picture became less certain. He found evidence of Bob's earlier marriage to his vaudeville partner, Grace Louise Troxell, a marriage dating to January 1933. He also found documentation showing that the earlier union ended later. But according to the research described in later accounts, he could not locate the marriage record one might expect to find for Bob and Dolores in Erie. No surviving license surfaced to settle the matter. Nor did the familiar wedding photographs one might expect from such a celebrated Hollywood marriage ever become part of the public record. None of this proves that Bob and Dolores were never legally married. Records can disappear, dates can be remembered incorrectly, ceremonies can be documented in ways that become difficult to trace many decades later. Even accounts of the timing of Bob's earlier divorce have not always been presented consistently. The responsible conclusion is therefore not that we know what happened, but that a question remains. And perhaps that uncertainty is more interesting than a sensational answer would ever be. Because by the time anyone seriously questioned the paperwork, the lives behind it had already been lived. Bob and Dolores had raised 4 children. They had shared homes, holidays, triumphs, illnesses, funerals, friendships, charities, and nearly an entire century of American history. She had watched his career grow from vaudeville stages to radio, Hollywood, television, and military bases around the world. He had watched the young nightclub singer he met in Manhattan become the woman who preserved their family and, in her 80s, found her way back to the stage. Other women had entered his story. Some stayed briefly. Some, according to later accounts, remained for years. Dolores knew at least enough that her daughter would later believe there had been little illusion about the life Bob was leading. Still, when Dolores looked back on the marriage, she did not describe herself simply as its victim. "If it hadn't been a good one, I'd never have stayed," she said. Perhaps those words are the closest thing we will ever have to her answer. Not because they explain everything, but because they refuse to. A marriage can look very different from inside than it does to people examining it decades later. Faith may have mattered, children may have mattered, security, companionship, history, forgiveness, affection, habit, and the enormous life they created together may all have mattered. We cannot know how Dolores weighed one against another, and we should be careful not to decide for her. What we do know is that year after year she stayed, and year after year, however far Bob traveled, he returned. In the end, perhaps the missing certificate is not the answer to the story at all. It is simply one final question. Because paper can tell us whether a government recorded a marriage. It cannot tell us what 2 people meant to each other across nearly 70 years. Bob and Dolores Hope left behind a relationship filled with contradictions, distance and permanence, disappointment and loyalty, public laughter and private silence. They now rest beside one another in the same quiet garden. And perhaps the real mystery was never why Dolores refused to leave. Perhaps it was how 2 people could live through everything they did and still choose, in whatever way they understood that word, to remain together. That answer belonged to Bob and Dolores, and they took it with them.